Okay. So sorry for the last week. I
Yeah.
had an emergency. Okay. So I'm going to make a short introduce of the book in Italian for and then we begin our conversation in English. Okay.
Okay.
Ok. Buongiorno a tutti e a tutte e benvenuti a questo appuntamento organizzato dal centro studi americani. Oggi abbiamo un'occasione preziosa di incontrare, seppure virtualmente, e conversare con il professore Tom Nichols. Nichols è uno dei più apprezzati e più influenti commentatori politici statunitensi, nonché professore ad Harvard dell'Extension School e allo US Naval War College. In Italia i suoi libri sono stati pubblicati dalla casa editrice Lewis University Press, collegata appunto alla stessa università. Dopo il bestseller pubblicato nel 2018, la conoscenza e i suoi nemici, oggi in Italia è stato pubblicato un nuovo saggio del professore, il cui titolo è Il nemico dentro, perché siamo noi stessi a distruggere la democrazia. Questo è il libro che potete trovare già da qualche settimana nelle librerie. Nel precedente saggio il professor Nichols analizzava i rischi della crescente disinformazione e dell'impoverimento delle competenze per la stessa qualità della nostra democrazia, delle nostre istituzioni e dunque del vivere in comune. In questo nuovo saggio un punto fondamentale è l'analisi delle nostre responsabilità rispetto alla crisi o cosiddetta delle democrazie liberali, cioè qual è il nostro ruolo come cittadini rispetto alla qualità stessa delle democrazie. E il professor Nichols invita in qualche modo a recuperare il senso e l'importanza delle nostre scelte rispetto alla qualità delle democrazie. È un saggio molto ricco che parte dall'analisi della crescente crescita e diffusione delle autocrazie e di questa deriva illiberale anche in democrazie consolidate. Un altro aspetto molto interessante è l'effetto dell'11 settembre e della guerra al terrore per la democrazia statunitense e quindi per la qualità anche delle istituzioni americane. E nel libro è possibile anche trovare molti riferimenti alla situazione in Europa, con un caso di scuola come la Brexit, che cosa ha rappresentato la Brexit, come è nata, come si è sviluppata e quali sono i suoi effetti oggi. E un altro aspetto molto interessante è l'analisi della situazione nell'est dell'Europa, quei paesi che dopo il 1989 hanno conosciuto un'apertura verso le democrazie liberali, oggi invece conoscono un passo all'indietro, una chiusura e una spinta illiberale. Dunque questo è un testo molto importante per orientarsi nel tempo che stiamo vivendo e nel concetto stesso e nell'evoluzione stessa della nostra democrazia. So, Professor, thank you for accepting our invitation. We are very glad to begin our conversation about the book Our Worst Enemy.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, as you wrote in the book, liberal democracies survive multiple dangers. Are democratic institutions still able to overcome complex challenges?
I'm not sure. I want to be an optimist by nature. Americans, I think, are optimistic about democracy, especially. We feel, many Americans over the past 50 years feel like they had a special mission with democracy during the Cold War. But I'm worried, as I wrote in the book, that years of affluence and high living standards and technological change have and peace have made us incapable, really, of attacking some of those complex problems because we tend to have very high expectations of government, but not very high expectations of ourselves.
Yeah. How did the ordinary citizen begin to think that it's not essential to live in a democracy?
You know, that's such an interesting question, because the people who think it's not essential to live in a democracy, I think, are people who have never lived anywhere except a democracy. And so it's easier for them to say, well, what's the big deal about democracy? Well, would it be so bad to live without it? I began my career studying the Soviet Union, and I spent quite a lot of time there in the 1980s. And I saw what an undemocratic system looks like. And I traveled a lot as a child. I mean, I lived in, I spent time with my family in Greece during the time of the junta. And I think when people say, well, it's not necessary to live in a democracy, I genuinely think that they say this because they have no idea what it would be like not to live in a democracy.
Yeah.
I think I'll add one other thing, which was that during the Cold War, we could see the Soviet Union and we saw what it looked like as an undemocratic system. Today, a lot of Americans and Europeans look at China and they say, what's so bad about China? It's rich, it has beautiful cities, skyscrapers, movies, all the things that the Soviet Union didn't have. The Soviet Union was drab and awful, and China looks pretty and sparkling. But the reality of China and other undemocratic systems is much more terrifying. And I think people just haven't internalized that. And so I think when they say it's not important to live in a democracy, they have no idea what they're talking about.
Yeah. Why did you argue in the book that above all citizens, we are failing to test the test of democracy?
I decided to put the blame on the shoulders of the citizens because that's where I think it belongs. Because in a democracy, we are the masters of our own fate. We choose our system of government. We choose our leaders. We might not like what we get because we have to compromise with other people. But I think as a moral issue, citizens of the democracies for far too long have pretended that they have no personal or moral agency. And they look at their government and they say, well, what can you do? This isn't my fault. When in fact, I mean, I can't speak for Italy, but here in the United States, we make choices about how we live every day. As I point out in the book, for example, the American people made a choice to be consumers. When you have 3 televisions in your house, that's a choice. That's not a necessity. That's a decision you made. And those decisions have second and third order effects about where those televisions have to be manufactured, who's going to sell them, how disposable they are. And I think it's become an excuse in democracies to say, well, I'm not really responsible for any of this. The elites did it. The people far away did it. The people in Washington or Rome or London or Ottawa did it. Those people are us. And I want citizens in democracies to recapture some sense of their own agency. They are not helpless victims of capitalism or democracy or anything else. They can make choices, but that requires making adult, painful, difficult choices. And I don't think we're, at least here in the United States, I don't think we're up to that. I recently wrote, I'm now a contributing writer at the Atlantic magazine. And I recently wrote a piece where I pointed out that I think the United States is just not a serious country anymore. We're not capable of making serious decisions about ourselves. And I want people to reclaim that for themselves.
Yeah. Which are the effects of narcissism and grudge on politics?
I think narcissism, it's strange to say this as we're living through a pandemic, but I think I actually think narcissism is the real pandemic we've been living through for 40 years. Here in the United States, we referred to the 1970s as the me decade. But I think the me decade never ended. And I think that the effect of narcissism in particular, you brought up the word grudge and resentment. When people live in a narcissistic culture, their expectations of everyone else and the government are very high. And when those expectations aren't met, they become resentful beyond all reason, beyond rationality. They resent everything. This is why in the book I used I tried not to drag in a lot of academic language, but I did bring up the Nietzschean term, Friedrich Nietzsche's term of ressentiment, which is even deeper than resentment. It's an anger at the world for the world not being what you want it to be. And for other people to be something that you resent. And that, but to go back to your earlier question about why I put this responsibility on the voters, this feeling is being experienced by people who are not economically badly off. That's the real shock underneath all of this, that this movement against democracy is not being led by the very poorest people. Here in the United States, the very poorest people are Black and Hispanic. They're voting. They're not, the ones mobilizing against liberal democracy. This is a middle class phenomenon. It's a middle class phenomenon in Italy, in the United States, in Poland and Turkey, everywhere else. And I think it is that sense of resentment that I don't have everything I deserve. And I deserve it because I'm the most important person in the world.
Yeah. What are the causes of the impoverishment of politics, debate, and even the offer to the voters?
Well, when you're dealing with a narcissistic electorate, you have two choices. You can tell the truth and lose, or you can encourage that sense of narcissism and you can win. We see that in American politics all the time. We saw it with Donald Trump. I will fix this. You deserve, I will give you, he literally said in 2016, I will give you everything you've always wanted. Now, that's impossible, of course. And only 8 years before, John McCain and Barack Obama, whether you like either of those men, they had a very honest debate where they said, these American factories are not going to reopen. They agreed about that. We have to have an agreement about fossil fuel and getting away from coal and oil. And they agreed about that. Now, I think American and in some other countries as well, but American politicians have figured out to say, don't say anything truthful or difficult. They'll throw you out of the room. So you walk in and say, you know what? You're right. And the other guy, he is your enemy. He's a bad person. He hates you. It's really strange that this takes extreme forms. I'm a former Republican. I quit the Republican Party over Donald Trump. But I was a conservative and an American foreign policy conservative. And there are now people on the right in America who have called me a communist in public, which is like, doesn't even make any sense in the American debate. So when you ask, what's happened to our debate? Well, we've become like children. Well, Tom Nichols disagrees with me. He's a communist, and that's, but that's easier. I'll just end with a quick story to get to your next question. I was giving a talk in West Virginia some years ago, about 2-3 years ago, before the pandemic. And I said, are there any questions? And this one gentleman, business owner, he said, what do you think about all this socialism in America? And I said, sir, America is many things, but it is not remotely socialist. And he said, well, I just see a lot of stuff. And I said to him, what do you think socialism means? And what he came down to was, socialism is anything I don't like. And any political leader if someone believes in, for example, abortion rights, well, they're a socialist. If someone believes in staying in NATO, they're a socialist. And these words have lost all meaning because and this comes back to the narcissism problem. These words have no meaning because they only have meaning in reference to yourself, that you become the only source of truth because nothing else matters. And you can't sustain a democracy that way.
Yeah. How did the pandemic will influence the relationship between politics and citizen?
I really thought the pandemic would bring us together. As you pointed out in your introduction, I wrote The Death of Expertise. I can't say it in Italian, but conoscenza.
La conoscenza e suoi nemici.
Thank you. I wish I spoke Italian. This is one great thing about having come to Italy to talk about these books, is that now I want to learn Italian. I really thought that people would gravitate toward experts, pull together, undertake a common burden, much as they did, during World War II or during the Great Depression or, during the Cold War. But instead, almost 800,000 Americans are dead. That's more deaths than there are more COVID deaths than in all the wars America fought except for the Civil War. Since World War I, that's more than all the combat deaths of American soldiers combined over 100 years. And we did it in 16 months. Pandemics, by their nature, are hard on a democracy because they encourage us to turn inward and close our doors and protect ourselves and to put on masks and to hide our faces. But I think a pandemic coming in the wake of 40 years of narcissistic, childish demands that the government fix everything every day was going to be a disaster. And I'll just add, here in the United States, we have these huge arguments over vaccination. That vaccine arrived in a year. That's a miracle. Even the people that support Donald Trump, who won't take the vaccine, the rest of us have tried to say to them, look, getting a vaccine in a year, that's something Donald Trump can take a little bit of credit for. And they don't want to hear it, because in the end, this very narcissist, and this is also a part of our problem with democracy, that there is this very narcissistic response that says, you are not the boss of me. You are not in charge. You can't tell me what to do. And of course, that's how you end up in a hospital with a ventilator in your throat.
Yeah. Which is the most comprehensive definition of populism?
Well, I regard populism almost entirely negatively as a word. And so, I have colleagues to my left and to my right who will disagree. I think of populism as an artificial attempt to divide a nation into two groups of people, the elites and the real people. That the real citizens, the real Americans, the real Italians. And I think it always ends in disaster, because populism is not good at governing. It's good at making people mad, and it's good at gaining power in the short term. It's a lousy way to govern, Because in the end, whether you're an educated company owner or a waitress, you're both citizens. And populism, to me, is the division of the country into two groups, a very small elite and a very large, the real country. And political entrepreneurs use that to tell the people they care about, you are the real people. These others, these elites, are not the real citizens. They are the enemy. I am an old school, I'm an old-fashioned 18th century American conservative. I do not believe that all opinions are equal. I agree with the late President James Madison, who helped write our Constitution, that democracies cannot survive unless they are led by people of virtue and intelligence. John Adams, who is from Massachusetts, as I am, President Adams worried very much that without civic virtue, without virtue within the people, democracy was impossible. And to me, populism derides that virtue. Populism dismisses that virtue and says the right thing is whatever a large number of uninformed people want. Because if they were informed or educated, they would be elites, and therefore they're not the real people. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of disaster.
As you wrote in the essay, the right populists became the worst menace to liberal democracy in the last 20 years. How could we explain the growth of authoritarian version of populism around the world?
Well, the problem is not, it used to be, let me start again and say, the problem that populism used to respond to was almost entirely economic. And so populism in the 19th century in America, for example, has its roots in the farming communities in the Midwest, who feel like their interests are being, their economic interests are being destroyed by banks in New York and Boston and San Francisco. The problem now is that the culture is changing. And you saw about 10 years ago that the authoritarians on the right tried to make populism an economic issue after the Great Recession, after the big housing crash and the 2008 bank problem. The problem for them is that cleared up relatively quickly with government intervention by the elites, right? The bailouts and all the other stuff. So, as I say in the book, these populist appeals quickly moved over to culture. The problem isn't that the banks are too big or that the economy is bad, because the economy wasn't bad. You couldn't keep making that argument. The problem is abortion and homosexuals and immigrants and transgender people, and it became all about trying to tell people in rural and non-urban communities, suburban communities, rural communities, your way of life is going to be destroyed by all of these scary freaks. Now, what's ironic, of course, is that at least here in America, the places with the most immigrants in them are actually very pro-immigration. The more diverse an area is, the less these cultural appeals matter. And so here in the US, and this is a word we have to bring into this discussion, here in the US, these appeals become fused to race. And when you have an appeal built on talking to white people in rural areas about religious and sexual and cultural matters, you have something that is custom built for a right-wing movement.
The FBI and the National Security Agency have declared that the white supremacy groups represent a main terrorist menace in the US. Could we say that the threats to American democracies is coming from within?
Absolutely. There's a reason I called the book Our Own Worst Enemy. But, you know, that's actually not new. I mean, there have been people inside the FBI and the National Counterterrorism Center and other organizations, at least here in the United States, that have been warning us for years that right-wing terrorism is the new threat. Remember the Oklahoma City bombing, which was right-wing terrorists, that was 25 years ago. You know, that's already a quarter century since. That was 1995. I mean, it's remarkable to think of that now, but because to me it seems like yesterday, but that's 25 years ago. So it's been at least that long that this has been happening. And I think this is actually linked to another problem, and I don't talk about this much in the book, but it's also linked to the kind of problem of lost and adrift young men who are looking for a purpose in life. These right-wing appeals are, again, they're custom made to appeal to young men with heroic fantasies because they are bored, because their jobs aren't interesting, they don't have stable relationships in their lives. And so I think the terrorism, and I've spoken with experts on terrorism in the United States about this, the terrorism threat that comes from this right-wing drift in American politics links up perfectly with these large groups of young white men who basically think that they should be superheroes instead of just going to work every day.
Yeah. What did you think when you heard the first news about the assault on Capitol Hill?
I wasn't surprised. And I was watching it in real time. And the first thing I thought was, these are not poor people. You know, because for 2 years, really since about 2015, the growth of the Trump phenomenon, many of my friends on the right said, well, this is because of, excuse me, this is because of globalization, and it's because of joblessness, and it's because of China, and it's because of, you know, and I pointed and I said, these people flew to Washington, D.C. and stayed in hotels wearing expensive military gear. This is not poor people. And sure enough, about a month afterwards, a group at the University of Chicago analyzed all the arrests. And these people were all professionals, accountants, real estate agents, dentists. And this, I think, confirms what I've been warning about, which is that the threat to democracy in my country and in yours comes from a bored middle class, from a middle class that lives with a very high standard of living and is bored out of its mind, and is looking for meaning and connection and importance and something that would be worthy of their narcissistic impulses. And I think January 6th proved that from top to bottom. I mean, these were young men who took their mothers with them to a riot. You know, these were retired military and police officers gearing up to go into battle over something they didn't even understand. I've been reading the court filings of the people that were arrested, and I don't think you'd be surprised, but I'm certainly not surprised at how many of them say, I just thought I was saying something important and striking a blow for democracy. And, you know, some of them now have even said, how could I have been so stupid? But when I saw January 6th, I said, these are middle class, these are not out of work factory workers. These are middle-class white people looking for meaning in their lives.
Yeah. May we compare this wound to American democracy with the September 11 attacks?
Well, my colleague George Will has said that he would like to see 1/6 become burned into the American mind the same way 9/11 is. I agree with him, not because the casualty totals were high enough, but because January 6th, and I am ashamed to say this as an American, January 6th was the first time that the peaceful transfer of power in America failed. We'd never had that happen before, much as January, well, I mean, since the Civil War, obviously. And whenever I say ever, everything is after 1865 in this country. But much like 9/11 was the first attack in, almost 2 centuries on American soil. And I think that we are in danger here in America of trivializing January 6th. January 6th was a watershed moment. It was a tipping point. It radicalized me in the sense that I now only have one criteria. I used to be a Republican, and I voted about low taxes and strong national defense. And I only have, as an independent voter, I only have one criterion now. Are you for or against constitutional democracy? I don't care about policy anymore. We can straighten out policy if our democracy survives. But for me now, in that sense, I have become radicalized, that I only care whether you are a friend or an enemy of the American constitutional system.
Yeah. About what you said about the Republican Party, how a man as a politician as Steve Bannon became a protagonist of the life of the party and with what we know.
Yeah. And of course, he's tried to become the life of some of your parties as well.
Yes, exactly.
Bannon, I think of people like Bannon as an accident. Donald Trump won in what I think of as a perfect storm. He was running against Hillary Clinton, who was the second most hated politician in America. Trump is the most hated. Hillary Clinton was number 2 at the time. I think his voters were spread out efficiently through the American Electoral College. Clinton's voters were clustered all on the coasts. He had an entire television network, Fox News, supporting him. And yet he loses the popular vote by 3 million votes. And I think largely because Hillary Clinton ran such a terrible campaign. And had Trump lost, you wouldn't know who Steve Bannon is today. Bannon ran Breitbart News, which, is struggling now. He is under indictment in the United States. Again, this time there will be no pardon. So I just think of him as a kind of an accident of history, that he and a lot of other people that you would never have heard of, Stephen Miller, Seb Gorka, Kayleigh McEnany, all of these kinds of, this whole circus of weirdos that kind of came into office with Trump, became national figures because of that one accidental week in November of 2016. And had that not happened, you would not hear of any of these people. Now, with that said, Bannon would have been, by running Breitbart, Bannon would have remained a destructive force in American politics, but he would not have become the major figure that he became for a while, and Russia and Italy and other places. So I think you don't want to spend too much time attributing this to talent. Some of it is just the accidental movement of history.
Yeah. Looking at the impact beyond 9/11, which are the consequences of the war on terror in the US, and how did the feeling of fear transform American politics?
That's a great question. And what it did, and I opposed this at the time, even though I was back then a conservative and a Republican, it militarized our politics. It militarized our police forces. I mean, you have police forces in Indiana and Nebraska and Alabama running around with military gear. Now, I can understand if you're the New York City Police Department and you're trying to police a city of, 12 million people that has nothing but foreign folks coming in and out on airports all day long, that might be a different problem. But you have small town police forces in the middle of America that have tanks, armored vehicles. This is insane. We created the Department of Homeland Security, a gigantic bureaucracy that I don't think functions very well. But it was almost like a return to the Cold War. Now I'm 61 years old, about to be 61 years old. And I remember during the Cold War in the 70s and the 80s, you could justify anything on the grounds of national security. So, well, it's a matter of national security. You're going to have to put up, you'll have to deal with the curtailing of your civil liberties. You will have to deal with high defense spending. You will have to deal with an intrusive national security state. After the Cold War, because I think some of those measures were reasonable and merited. After the Cold War, I wanted them to go away. I consider myself a civil libertarian. And 9/11 brought all of that back. It's a matter of national security. We have to curtail your civil liberties. We have to spend a lot of money on defense. And really, it was for a threat that turned out to not be much of a threat.
Yeah. Coming to Europe, this is my last question. What did you find most meaningful in the political analysis of Brexit?
Much like here in America, I found the debate about Brexit among our British cousins. I mean, as you know, we Americans, we think of the British as an extended part of our family, and vice versa. I found them to be unserious, just like the Americans. This was not a serious debate, and it was not a serious vote. I mean, you don't change the course of a country's history with one night of voting. And I think what really struck me, and of course, at the time I was writing The Death of Expertise, what really struck me was how many people were voting for Brexit who really had no idea what it was going to do. Much like the Trump voters in America, they said, let's see what happens. Well, sometimes throwing the dice is dangerous. And I think even now, you'll see that with Brexit, that the British are constantly saying, well, we didn't see this coming. We didn't expect that to happen. And we're not sure why this is going on. When of course, the experts 5, 6, 7 years ago said, all these things are going to happen. The other thing that really strikes me about Brexit is, once again, and this comes back to your question, Gabriele, about populism, that the elites who led the Brexit fight, like Boris Johnson, they didn't believe in it. They didn't care about it. They laughed about it behind closed doors. My colleague at The Atlantic, Ann Applebaum, wrote about how Boris Johnson, behind closed doors at dinners, would laugh about Brexit and how stupid it was. But to be prime minister, as I said earlier, you don't come out and tell the people the truth. You come out and say, Brexit. I'm with you because I am one of you, because you are the real people, not these other fake elites over here. And that is the worst dishonesty there is. If you are an elite, a leader, a public intellectual, a scientist, a professor, whatever, you have an obligation to tell the truth. You have an obligation to not just to speak truth up to power. You have an obligation to speak truth to your own people. And that didn't happen in Brexit. There were all kinds of crazy promises. Oh, this will end immigration, and we'll get money back from the European Union, and we'll, the Americans will bail us out. We'll have a special trade. None of that happened. And it was a stupid idea that was promulgated for stupid reasons. There are good arguments, and I will just finish by saying this. There are good arguments for exiting the European Union. In 1992, I was a young professor. I was skeptical of the European Union. My family, most of my family in Europe lives in Greece. And the minute they talked about a European Union, I said, oh, wait a minute. There's one country I can think of that's going to be a problem here, and it's where my family lives. But I think once the European Union was created and became a force for peace and stability and security in Europe, then it had to be maintained. And it had to be taken care of with more thought than simply saying, well, we'll just walk out one day and see what happens. And I think the people who made those arguments were being fundamentally dishonest in some way.
Yeah. One more question about Europe. Did you expect the drift, a liberal drift of Eastern Europe in countries as Poland or Hungary?
One of the great disappointments of my professional life is that I really thought that the people who had suffered the most under the Soviet Union would hold the line the hardest against authoritarianism. And I think generational change has a lot to do with that. I think you have people now who just really have no memory of what it was like. I teach a course on the history of the Cold War, even now at Harvard Extension. And maybe I just do it because I don't want people to forget what it was like. I really had hoped that the new I knew that they would have trouble establishing themselves. Democracy is an act of will. Democracy requires faith and resilience and a certain amount of toughness. And I knew that it would be difficult to get those democracies off the ground. But I even hoped that in Russia, democracy was going to stay. Maybe that story isn't over yet. Yeah. But it's hard to be optimistic right now.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Professor, for your time and attention. And we suggest to our readers to take Il Nemico Dentro. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.